Guys, the 2023 Belgian Grand Prix weekend is over, and that means the summer break is upon us. But first, we need to go over what happened this weekend in Belgium around the Circuit Spa-Francorchamps, the longest circuit on the F1 calendar. And we had a lot of exciting action. Weather played a part, and fortunately, we got a relatively dry running in the Grand Prix. We're going to go over my race quick hits, as long as some other weekend notes, since it was, in fact, a sprint race weekend. And we'll go over our winners and losers for the weekend, as well as go over what we expect to see to look forward to post-summer break. And finally, we'll wrap things up going over the predictions that I made before the weekend began and see how they fared. Let's go ahead, jump on into it. As we all know, the Belgian Grand Prix weekend was a sprint race weekend, which means 2 qualifyings, 2 races, and only 1 practice to go forward on. We saw a lot of weather play a part in both practice 1 as well as qualifying and the sprint race. Max Verstappen ends up winning the sprint race as well as the full Grand Prix, but we saw some exciting action up and down the field in both races as well as qualifying. Let's go ahead. Let's jump straight into our quick hits. Let's start with the Grand Prix since that did just finish up today. It was a Red Bull 1-2. Pretty yawn-worthy, if I do say so myself. Lewis Hamilton was able to snatch the fastest lap from Max to keep him from doing a full sweep this weekend, so that might have been the only exciting thing outside of maybe the first few laps of the Grand Prix. Ferrari had a very up and down Grand Prix today. Charles Leclerc ends up finishing on the podium after starting in pole position, with Max Verstappen starting P6 thanks to his grid penalty. And unfortunately, on the other inside of the garage, Carlos Sainz making contact with Oscar Piastri in turn 1 at the race start, and unfortunately had to retire a few laps later with a pretty severe damage to his side pod. And what they claimed was only 5% aero reduction and aero effect reduction. It seemed like it was going to do a lot more than that, as Carlos pretty swiftly fell down the order and eventually got to the point where I think Ferrari made the right decision to just go ahead, retire that car, and move on for the summer break. Oscar Piastri on the other end of that contact retired on that same lap, tried to give it a go and get around to the other side of the circuit, but unfortunately was unable to do so and retired on lap 1. Thankfully, they were able to clear away the car in time in relatively quick succession, and so there wasn't a safety car or even a virtual safety car, which surprised a lot of us. Moving on to Mercedes, they had a very good result from this weekend. Basically, I think they got almost the maximum they could out of the Grand Prix. They finished both in the points in the sprint race as well, so the fact that they got not necessarily maximum points, but they got really solid points this weekend is nothing to be overlooked about. Lewis comes home in P4 with the fastest lap, and George actually doing one of the few one-stops in the full Grand Prix to come home and finish P6 as well. A very good drive from George to make that work. It was very impressive considering the amount of deg that we were seeing from a lot of the other drivers out there as well. So it was a good result for Mercedes, even though they are still well off the pace of the fronts. A few cars in some of these circuits, it seems like they're almost like a decent at a lot of things, but not good at any one particular thing, which I think puts a very low ceiling on them, but also it gives us a fairly high floor though. So it'll be interesting to see what they look like after the summer break finishes. Moving on to Aston Martin, I think they get their best result in a Grand Prix in more than a few races with a P5 from Fernando Alonso. Lance Stroll also comes home to finish P9. A very, very good result for Aston, who's been scoring double points, but they've been like a P9, P10 kind of double points. And so a P5 from Fernando Alonso is a solid result for them. Now Alonso only leads Lewis Hamilton by 1 point in the driver's standings. That is going to be a fun battle to follow as we get down the second half of the season. And I would point out that without Lewis Hamilton's penalty in the sprint race for his contact with Sergio Perez, Lewis would actually be leading Fernando Alonso in the Drivers' Championship as well. So that's something to keep an eye out as we get down the back half of this season. Moving on to McLaren, it seems like they made the decision to really load up on the aero for a wet weekend and potentially trying to capitalize on, while there may not have been forecasted rain for Sunday, they really tried to maximize load on the off chance that rain might have appeared. And so they load up the aero. It looked like it worked in practice, qualifyings, and the sprint race, with Oscar Piastri finishing P2 in the sprint race, his best result, even if it is just in a sprint race. And so you can see the extra load of aero really did help them. But once we got to Sunday and the dry running showed up, obviously Oscar DNFing in lap 1. Lando did very well to finish P7, I believe, in the full Grand Prix. You could definitely tell the difference between the aero loads on everyone else's cars versus the McLaren. The McLaren was very draggy in a straight, and realistically it's Spa. That's really where you don't want to be lacking the most. So a very, very solid result for Lando considering the positions and the car setup. Don't know if they could have gotten much more than that. As we get down towards the second half of the order, I want to give a big shout out to Yuki finishing P10 and AlphaTauri beating Daniel Ricciardo fairly handedly. Daniel finishing in P16 and never really looking too competitive. He has some punchy moments battling down the bottom half of the field, but Yuki did a very, very good job in finishing in the points. And we'll go into more of this here in a second for one reason or another. But the Williams was a fairly severely disappointing this weekend. I know that this is a track that they usually do pretty good at, considering how aerodynamically efficient they are in a straight line. Unfortunately, I don't know if it was weather or what, but Williams really struggled. And then lastly, for my quick hits, Haas had a very horrific weekend. I could go on a rant, and in fact, I might make a separate video over this summer break, kind of going over the faults that Haas had earlier this weekend. They basically failed to get Nico Hülkenberg a chance at qualifying in both the regular qualifying and the sprint qualifying, the latter of which might have been the most egregious, because at least in the full Grand Prix qualifying, Nico had a hydraulic issue, and they just struggled and were unable to get him back out of the garage in time, which, sometimes happens. But the sprint qualifying is probably the most egregious because they aborted Nico's laps multiple times to try and be last to cross the line. And unfortunately, the timing just didn't work out. And Nico didn't even set a time for sprint qualifying and started last in both sessions. And honestly, I think considering where they finished in both races, it's almost a wonder they even finished that high. So not a good weekend for Haas. It looked like it could have had a few moments, but we'll cover them a little bit more when we're going over my predictions. But let's go ahead. We can take a look at what we're looking for post-summer break. As we know, we're heading into a few weeks with no Grand Prix as the team get an opportunity to reset and regroup after the first half of the season. I think the things that we're looking for the most are development plans, run plans, and trying to decide who's going to continue focusing on this year's car versus learning about the 2024 car and turning their eyes towards that. Obviously, I think Red Bull has already almost fully begun to turn their eyes towards the 2024 car. They might have upgrades slated to come, but in terms of future development, I think that will likely come entirely on the 2024 car. And so potentially, if we're looking for an opportunity to see another race winner, it might have to come near the end of the season when the Red Bull development for this year kind of closes a little bit. I think Ferrari and Mercedes likely will continue looking at this year's car, Mercedes especially. Mercedes is still trying to get a grasp on the W14 and this new look with the side pods, trying to get a good understanding of this foundation so they can continue to move forward. Aston Martin is another one that I think a lot of people are cautiously optimistic about going into the back half of the season. We haven't heard a whole lot on whether or not they're going to be coming with another major upgrade package, but they've kind of really slowed down the last few weeks, and they might move into more of a, similar to Mercedes, a fact-finding and data-finding mission to understand this year's car to then apply it forward to next year's car. McLaren also is a big question mark. They've obviously, I think, spent a lot of money on developing this year's car and getting a lot of those components on, so who knows what more they have in the tank for the rest of this season. But I think that top 5 or maybe even 6 teams, if we throw Alpine in there as well, is going to be extremely fascinating to watch. And this is just another indication that if you could just throw out Red Bull and just stop paying attention to Red Bull, this has got to be one of the closest, most exciting seasons of Formula One we've seen yet. But obviously, we can't always do that, and we have to take into account the fact that Red Bull is dominating. And so, while the championships may not be that exciting, the on-track aspects, both on the literal track during race days and behind the scenes in terms of development, is going to be extremely, extremely exciting. I'm also curious to see which of the bottom few teams kind of take a step forward going into the bottom half of the season. And this is where I want to ask you a question. Leave a comment down below. Which of the bottom 4 teams, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, Haas, and Williams, makes the biggest jump out of the bottom group? I think it could be a very exciting thing to watch, and I for one can't wait to see which one comes out on top. But I think that's a good point to stop there. We'll talk more over the summer break about what's coming up in the next half of the season. But let's go ahead and move on to our weekend winners and weekend losers. We move on now to our weekend winners and our weekend losers. It could be a team, it could be a driver, it could be a team principal, it could be pretty much whatever we want. And we'll start with our weekend winner. I've gone for a driver with this one. I think this is a result that they can really, really take and improve on as we head into the summer break. And I have gone for Yuki Tsunoda. Yuki obviously has had a lot of eyes on him after the return of Daniel Ricciardo in Hungary last time out. And so to come into Belgium and beat Daniel Ricciardo fairly decisively and score points in that AlphaTauri, I think it deserves a huge round of applause. And it's definitely a huge boon for him, I think, kind of going forward. It kind of really sets the tone. I think a lot of people were ready to write him off after Hungary when Daniel ends up beating him in his, quote, first time out in the AlphaTauri. And so to come into the next weekend and really set the tone, I think this battle back and forth between Daniel and Yuki in the second half of the season could be very, very good and very exciting to watch. But it is a huge, huge boost to him, and congratulations, Yuki, on scoring points. We're still waiting on that, above a P10 finish, but at the same time, scoring points in the AlphaTauri is nothing to sneer at too hard. So congrats, Yuki, you are my weekend winner. Flipping the script, looking at the other side of that same coin, we have our weekend losers. And this is a bit of a tough one, really, when you look at it this way. But Williams, I have gone for you as my weekend losers. A lot of people were expecting you to come into Spa and really put on a good show. And while we did see good moments, Alex Albon was absolutely flying through the field in this one, but ultimately kind of finished nowhere near the points at the same time. I know a lot of people were really expecting you to come in and, have a good outing. Even a bit of a spoiler as we get to our next section after this, my prediction results, I predicted Logan Sargent as my biggest positive surprise. I thought it was a very distinct possibility that Logan Sargent could be looking at his first points in F1 this weekend as they head to Spa. That Williams is a fantastic car in a straight line, and we saw it multiple times today with Alex flying up through the field. But unfortunately, it just could not cope in the poor weather of qualifying in the sprint race, and realistically, they leave Spa with nothing really to show for it. It's very disappointing, and at the end of the day, that's just a tough weekend in Belgium. And so I'm sorry, Williams, you are my biggest losers for the Belgian Grand Prix. We'll quickly now run through my prediction results, and we're not going to spend too much time on them because I think that a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. We'll start with going over my biggest positive surprise. Like I mentioned in Weekend Losers segment, my biggest positive surprise was Logan Sargent. I thought Logan was going to come in and perform extremely well in a Williams. Many expected to perform at Spa, and unfortunately, I don't know if it was the weather or what, but unfortunately, it just didn't come to fruition. And so, Logan, I'm sorry, but I can't give you my point for biggest positive surprise. I'm 0-1 so far. And we'll move in directly to biggest disappointment. My prediction for the biggest disappointment was going to be Ferrari. While I don't think Ferrari had the best weekend, Charles Leclerc does end up finishing on the podium in the Grand Prix, which is a fantastic result from starting from pole, especially against this Red Bull team that seems so dominant. And so really it's kind of looking at on a weekend where both Checo and Max perform to that car's ability. I mean, finishing P3 almost could be looked like a win in itself. And so Ferrari, I think, had a very solid weekend. Carlos DNFing is a factor, but they had a pretty solid result in this sprint race overall. And at the end of the day, I don't think it was bad enough. It might not have been good enough to be considered biggest positive surprise, but it's certainly good enough to not be my biggest disappointment. So I am currently 0-2 on my predictions so far. We move now to qualifying results. I predicted a Lewis Hamilton P3, a Lando Norris P2, which ultimately ended up not coming to fruition. Both Lewis and Lando both had issues in qualifying. Lando's McLaren was loaded up on aero, which really held them back in terms of the aero, the straight line speed. And so McLaren actually for the full Grand Prix had a very iffy qualifying, at least as compared to Hungary and Silverstone the weekends before that. And then for pole position, this is where we need to get a little bit, we need to have a real talk. For pole position, I predicted Max Verstappen, but I made that prediction before I knew about his 5th place grid penalty. And so while he may not have started on pole, he did finish 8 tenths ahead of everyone else in qualifying. And so while he didn't start in pole, I am giving myself the point for Max Verstappen pole, because when you're 8 tenths clear of even your teammate in the same car, I am giving you the point for that, because that is dang impressive. And even though he didn't start on pole, I'm giving myself the point. So 1 for 3 in qualifying, and we are 1 for 5 to start with. This is not looking good, and I'm sure you can see where this is going. Moving forward now to my sprint winner. This was an easy pick. Max Verstappen, sprint winner all day. It did have a moment there where Oscar Piastri was leading the sprint, and while it was exciting to see, I don't think any of us truly believed that Oscar was going to be able to hold off Max for the entire time. And once the safety car came out for Fernando Alonso, it was all but dusted, I think, at that point, and Max went on to win by, I believe, about 6 seconds. And so a Max Verstappen sprint winner, not the hottest of takes, but at least the sprint race had its moments. So that's 1 for 1 in the sprint race, and I am now 2 for 6, a solid 33%. As we move on to my podium predictions, I predicted a Max Verstappen win, that's a point, a Lando Norris P2, which ultimately ended up basically being dashed the moment they qualified in the bottom half of the top 10, and a Sergio Perez P3. So a 1 point for Max Verstappen, no points for Lando Norris, and I've done this in the past. If I predict someone on the podium in the wrong spot, I give myself a half point. So 1.5 out of 3 of my podium predictions now leaves us at 3.5 out of 9. Kind of holding form, not the best weekend we've ever had, but it can all be salvaged with my Haas predictions of the race weekend. I predicted 1 car into Q2 of Grand Prix qualifying, and we got that. Shout out Kevin Magnussen for finally getting out of Q1. It has been quite a long time since we've seen Kevin show up in qualifying, and while we didn't expect great things in Spa, we're excited to see that Kevin gets out of Q1 for the first time, and Nico, unfortunately, like we talked about earlier, was knocked out due to a hydraulic issue, and so that is 1 point for me, 1 car into Q2. Going on to SQ2, I also predicted 1 more car into SQ2. I thought Nico actually would be able to drag the car into SQ2 and Q2. Unfortunately, Nico had issues in both qualifying sessions, and Kevin was unable to make it out of SQ1. And so unfortunately, that is 0 for 1 in my predictions of 1 car into SQ2. And now this one might be a bit of a cop-out, but my last prediction right now has been no points in either race. And while there were multiple points during the Grand Prix, we had both cars running in the points of the Grand Prix this morning, but it just wasn't meant to be. So unfortunately, that's a 1 of 1 on that too. So my Haas predictions, I went 2 out of 3, and that brings my total final tally to 5.5 out of 12 total points, almost 50%. And when you really start off very strong, very powerful with 0 for 2 in your biggest positive surprise and biggest disappointment, to kind of claw that back with podium predictions, some Haas predictions that you might have been a little more down on at the end of the day. It is what it is. But how did you do? Let me know how you did on your predictions down in the comment section below. And there it is, guys. The Belgian Grand Prix in the first half of this Formula One season has come and gone. And while we may know who is going to win the drivers and who is going to win the constructors, there are still a lot of storylines we need to keep an eye on in terms of who's going to finish best of the rest in the constructors, who's going to finish best of the rest in the drivers. It's going to be an extremely fun time to be following Formula One outside of the top team. I hope you guys don't check out. I think the season has been, obviously I've only been following for almost a season and a half at this point, and so it definitely feels like the most exciting season that I've seen so far, just in terms of on track closeness, like the distance between the teams outside of Red Bull, I don't know if I've ever seen as closer right now. And so Red Bull really is skewing the results. But at the end of the day, it's going to be extremely fun to watch. I have the fortunate pleasure of getting to go to multiple races in the back half of the season. And so I'm excited to see more Formula One action in this summer break. I think will do us all some good to step away. But at the same time, I know in about a week, I'll never want it back more. F1 heads to the Netherlands and the sands and the dunes of Zandvoort next time out here in about a month. I can't wait already. I'm getting excited just talking about it. I know I was ready to take a break and think about it, but thinking about seeing them back out on circuit again in Zandvoort is going to be very exciting. But for now, we have a summer break to wait for. But if you are a Formula One fan, hit that subscribe button down below. And if you tell me what you thought of the Belgian Grand Prix weekend. It seemed to be all over the place in terms of weather and on-track action, where everyone was finishing. And so I'm excited to see what you guys think. But for now, I'll see you guys over the summer break. I have a couple of ideas of some videos to do planned, as well as obviously some F1 Manager 23 and F1 23 videos as well. But until F1 comes back and we'll make our predictions for Zandvoort, then I'll see you guys in the next one.